Okay, we did it.
Yeah, I don't know what happened just now. Good for yourself.
Wow, you can find
Take a landscape.
Yeah, so my grandmother looked shorter.
There you guys go.
Thank you. Thank you. You guys are great.
Projects like that.
Yeah.
Looking forward to what's next. Get some friends.
Yeah.
It's actually easier I have a lot of
Hi, I'm Gary. Brian, how you doing?
So Mario was also my first professor.
Really? That's weird, man. He's pretty young. I mean, like, young.
looks young.
Yeah, exactly.
He looks very young.
I agree. But
Yeah.
he's younger than me.
I mean, he's older.
I actually don't know.
I bet he's only 60.
It looks like we have everyone. I think we're a few minutes late.
So, first off, I only have 4 books, so some people are going to have to share.
Do you want to start?
No, sorry. So, for my thesis, I wanted to write a book. I told myself I could do it, and for a while, I really believed that, but I quickly realized that I wasn't ready to write the kind of book that I hoped to publish, at least not yet. Still, the act of trying to write it was crucial because it made me stop and ask what actually matters, what I want to say, and more importantly, why. This project became a space to answer those questions, not by choosing a topic, but by following a line of thought until it started leading somewhere. The central question, the question that I wanted to ask, that I kept circling back to, is what is the real purpose of architectural education? Is it to produce designers, problem solvers, intellectuals, artists, workers? Is it about learning how to think, or how to draw, or how to shape the world, or just living in it? At some point, I stopped asking what it was supposed to be and started asking what I needed to understand. I was frustrated with school, and I know that I'm not the only one. Not because I didn't want to learn, but because so much of the system seemed uninterested in letting me. Everything felt backwards. The parts of work that mattered most to me often felt like they were invisible to the people grading me, and the parts that seemed easiest to check off were often the ones that I had to prioritize to stay afloat. It felt like I was constantly pretending to understand the rules, pretending to agree with the system, and pretending that I was fine with the way things were. So, when I started this thesis, I didn't want to design a building. I wanted to design something I could believe in, and the book became a way to do that. A space for me to lay out everything, the problems I faced, the ideas I wish I had, and the structures I felt were missing. It was never just about writing. It was about reorganizing my thoughts, reclaiming my experience, and turning my education into something useful for other people too. This is how the project started and what brought me here today. When I began this process, I found myself circling one question again and again. What is an architectural thesis? Not just what's allowed, but what's expected and what's it for. I asked around and searched for definitions. I got so many thoughtful, generous answers, but they all pointed in different directions. Some said a thesis could be about anything. It could be a building, a book, a provocation, a project. Others described it as act of synthesis, a place to bring everything together. Still, others said it was another studio, but one where you get to set your own rules. And all of that can be true, but for me, it wasn't enough just to know what was permitted. I wanted to understand what it meant. I struggled with how open the process was. I wasn't against freedom, but I found it hard to move forward without a frame. It's like being given an infinite blank sheet with no prompt, no guide, no north arrow. But for some people, that might be exhilarating. But for me, it was paralyzing, and the more I tried to define my own path, the more I wished there were examples, not to imitate, but to react to, models, structures, ways in, not rules, but rhythms. A way of saying, here's one way this could go, and here's what you might try, here's what you might be trying to do by finding it. Over time, I began to think of Thesis as a kind of practice. Not a performance, not just a product. A practice is something you return to, something you shape through repetition, something you explore with intentionality. That framing changed everything for me. I meant I could stop chasing the perfect outcome and instead focus on building a meaningful process. A process of learning, of questioning, of writing, rewriting, and reframing. A thesis, in that sense, isn't about declaring what you know, it's about discovering what you need to ask, and designing the work that helps you ask it well. I'm not saying the open model doesn't work. For many students, it probably does, and that's a good thing. But for me, for people like me, who crave structure, rhythm, and clarity, I think there should be another option. Not a one-size-fits-all, but a parallel one, a more intentional scaffold, a shaped process that allows for complexity and growth, but does so within a clear framework. A thesis process with defined phases, with optional benchmarks, with a sequence of questions that builds towards a set of outcomes, not to restrict students, but to support them when they don't yet know how to support themselves. That's the structure I started building for myself, and it's what my project became. A way to figure out how to move forward when the freedom to go anywhere felt like being lost. A way to turn reflection into direction, a way to ask, what do I care about? What is worth spending a year exploring? And how can I make that process legitimate, repeatable, and useful? These weren't questions I answered easily, but they're the ones that gave my thesis a shape, and they're the ones that I want to make easier for students to ask in the future. I didn't finish a book, at least not in a traditional sense. What I made instead is a kind of blueprint, a framework, a system in motion, a design for how architectural education could work. It's not clean, it's not final, but it's honest, and to me it's useful. For me, it's far more valuable than anything I could have wrapped in a cover and called complete. At some point, this wasn't just a book about my experiences. It wasn't just a critique or a proposal or a curriculum. It became all those at once folded together. It's structured to move forward from personal observation to pedagogical philosophy to practical application. From this is what I went through, to this is what I learned, to this is how someone else might build forward from it. The book is built in 5 parts. Each one speaks to a different scale of thinking. It begins with student-facing reflections, an honest look at the invisible pressures inside architecture school, and how to navigate them without losing yourself. Then it moves to a vision for open, adaptable pedagogy, a reframing of school as infrastructure, curriculum as commons, and a learning as a process of design. Between those two, I place a standalone chapter on the journal, not as a sketchbook, but as an interface of thought, communication, and iteration. And this leads to the core of the book, which is a full semester-by-semester curriculum optimized into 5 progressible phases, from drawing to modeling to structure, autonomy, and thesis. And finally, the book ends with an open archive, case studies, experiments, tools, and works in progress. Each part informs the other, and each part is an invitation to continue the conversation. I didn't set out to create a curriculum, but the more I tried to understand what I needed, the more I started sketching one out. Not to replace the education I received, but to supplement it. To say, here's what I wish I had when I didn't know what to ask for. I wanted to map to an alternate path, to track the structure, intention, and pacing for people who think that like I do. Not to tell them what to make, but to help them make sense of what they're making. That's what the book became. Not a polished thing to defend, but a living document of how I learned to move forward. At the core of this book is a semester-by-semester curriculum, not a rigid syllabus, not a universal standard, but a structured path, one that builds step-by-step from foundational skills to open exploration. It's designed to serve students who need more than freedom, students who are ready to work, but unsure where to begin. The curriculum is scaffolded in 5 phases. Each one adds complexity, and each phase grants more freedom. Each phase is designed with intentional progression in mind. Phase 1 is about tools. Semester 1 teaches you how to draw, analyze, and observe, not just how to make a line, but how to read architecture through drawing. Students are graded on competency with clear visual benchmarks. Drawing is treated as both a skill and a study. Semester 2 introduces physical thinking through model making, not just what a model is, but how materials behave, how form, structure, and choice inform design. This phase is highly structured, not to limit students, but equip them with the vocabulary, habits, and fluency to take ownership later. Phase 2 shifts to context. Semester 3 explores how sight, story, and function shape a project. It introduces narrative design, not as metaphor, but as a spatial logic. Students are asked to design with intention, grounded in where and why their building exists. Semester 4 brings in urban thinking and public presentation. Students identify real needs, work in teams, and present to outside jurors. They learn how to communicate across disciplines, how to program a site, and how to balance individual vision with real-world constraints. This is where students begin testing their skills in a broader, more social context. Phase 3 is about integration. Semester 5 introduces constraints, not as obstacles, but as creative tools. Students are given a site and asked to set their own rules. And then, strategically break them. This teaches flexibility, decision-making, and authorship. Semester 6 focuses on real-world systems, building code, structural logic, practical constraints. Students are asked to demonstrate, not guess, how their designs hold up. It's not about technical competency, it's about design literacy, being able to speak in both art and engineering. By this point, students have been given the tools and they've worked with context, and now they're being asked to prove understanding through responsible integrated work. Phase 4 is the turning point. Here, students select from curated design studios offered by faculty. Each studio focuses on different interests, but share common standards and deliverables. This is where students begin to share their own identity as designers, not by wandering aimlessly, but by testing what they care about. Through structured experimentation, they receive qualitative feedback and engage in self-assessment. This is the phase that mirrors the spirit of a thesis, but with more scaffolding, a space for deeper refinement, before full independence. The final phase is the culmination. Students choose one of two paths: a capstone design project where they synthesize everything from drawing to theory to technical systems, or a research thesis focused on a specific topic aiming to contribute to the architectural discourse or pedagogy. In both tracks, students are asked to reflect, to document not just what they produced, but how they got there and why it matters. Not just as a finish line, but as a statement of intent, a rehearsal for the kind of practice that they want to have and the kind of world they want to build in. So yes, this curriculum is a sequence. More importantly, it is a philosophy of teaching. It prioritizes transparency, giving clear goals and visible benchmarks, adaptability, focusing with students with different speeds, different minds, reflection, having writing, critiquing, and revising as integral parts, iteration, learning as a loop and not a ladder, access, making architecture legible to more people. Because structure isn't the enemy of creativity. Used well, structure makes creativity visible. It gives students something to push against and something to hold on to. That's what I've tried to build. This project has taught me a lot, but maybe the most important thing it's taught me is how to keep going when the path isn't clear. Early on, I thought I was writing a book, then I realized I was building a system, and then I realized the system was the book. And now I can say with confidence, I built something I couldn't have imagined at the beginning, something rooted in experience and pointed toward possibility. I've had to reteach myself architecture in order to imagine how things can be taught differently. This meant stepping back from what I was told to do and asking what actually helped me learn. What ideas stuck, what methods worked, what moments lit something up in me that felt worth chasing, and how to turn those moments into tools someone else can use. It's what I meant when I said this is a framework. It's not a curriculum, it's not just a curriculum, it's not just a critique, it's a toolkit, a starting point and a draft for a better structure. So now the work continues through what I'll continue to build, through lessons planned, through student-facing resources, and through more writing, testing, and listening. Even if the work is ongoing, my direction is clear. I know what I want to build, and I know who I want to build it for. I know that the kind of teacher I want to be because of the experience of having a student. That's the real outcome of this thesis. It isn't just the content of the book, it is the alignment between my values and my work. In the long run, I do want to help create a vision of architectural education that doesn't require students to decode it on their own, where goals are clear, the structure is supportive, and the freedom to explore is backed by enough scaffolding that students won't ever feel like they're starting from zero. And I don't think that version needs to be locked within universities. It can be public, it can be shared, and it can be built collaboratively between teachers, students, and the field itself. That's what I'm aiming for, and that's what the project I want to keep building long after this presentation ends. Now, I want to pause. This presentation isn't a defense, and it's not a pitch, and it's not the end of this project. It is a checkpoint, a moment where I show where I am and where I'm going. There are still questions I haven't answered, there are sections I still want to write, and there are tools that I want to test, refine, and share. And I want this room to be part of the process, not just an audience, but as fellow thinkers. And the last slide is questions that I kind of want to dig deeper into and get answers from jury members and committee members. Yeah, that's the end of the top of it.
So is the impetus of this you're just tackling the thesis process itself, right? Not the entire curriculum.
No, the entire curriculum in a way.
Okay. I mean, it sounded like the thesis process, deciding what the thesis is, the amount of independence that you have during this year versus other years. Sounded like the main.
Well, it's not necessarily the freedom that I've had this year versus other years. It's more of the consistent lack of clarity that I've had in my own time of in between each year not exactly knowing where to go. And the thesis was almost the culmination of that, to where it is this kind of broad, semi-ill-defined thing that I wasn't unsure where to go through, where to start.
You said multiple times, people like me. What does that mean?
Well, one of the main starting points of this was kind of my own self-discovery and diagnoses of ADHD and other neurodiverse kind of, whatever the word would be, diagnoses. And that kind of led me towards this line of thinking of, is this structure the best way that we can teach everybody?
So this is a supplement for students like that, who like, I need some more framework?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a huge part of the conversation. That perspective. My wife's an occupational therapist, so she definitely, we've had lots of conversation about how you learn, different people learn differently and how to focus, within certain environments, what changes in your life, so many things. So, but is that in this book?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
To some degree. Whenever I, between the first 2 semesters is where I made a major shift towards, because in the first semester I had this idea. About halfway through, I shifted pretty heavily towards the ADHD, but it never sat right with me to focus so heavily on that, because a lot of the issues that I faced are not ADHD specific. A lot of the issues that I faced, everybody around me faced them the same way, unless everybody that goes into architecture is ADHD, which would not be entirely shocking. But there were so many things that I did want to talk about that didn't have anything to do with that, but that was more the impetus for the beginning, I guess.
I mean, it's certainly part of the story, to how you engage or how somebody engages. Like, do you need that path? Does that path work best for you? I mean, I think professors from within their class are trying to navigate within their personal guidance, each student in their how they recommend and desks to proceed with the project is based on a reflection. I think good professors are reflecting and amplifying what they hear, and based on the parameters that they know of that student, how they work, to explore it in that way. So I feel like the education is deeply personal in architecture versus other educations, because when you go into a lecture class, you're given the material in the same way to every person, whereas architecture is individually based. One thing I thought, there's a lot of discussion about the curriculum and projects that it does happen outside of the students. What is the real basis that you're trying to get to with the project? What is the real transition? Was it successful or not? That there are discussions that happen, and I wonder how fruitful that would. It doesn't take away from whether you, if you go through that, you should get to the same point without necessarily knowing I'm supposed to get here, because sometimes when you say you're supposed to get here, you don't get there because you try to leap ahead to that and not understanding that the process.
I think that's actually one of the biggest problems I've had in school is a lot of projects that I've had have this destination of what they're trying to teach in mind, but especially some of the early projects, they don't always tell you what the goal of the project is until you've fulfilled it, kind of hoping that they're not going to lead you in a direction, whenever to know where that direction is how you design.
But the goal could be to learn a set of processes to get to a goal, but not to
What do you
put
mean
the
a set of
professor's goal on the project. Like by giving certain open-endedness, they teach you how to use the tools of the process to come to your own goal. Yeah, but if they give you the goal, then you may not come to a unique solution.
Like personally, I don't think you necessarily should teach processes as like, I believe you should teach processes as processes and how to use a process, and then you can ask them to use the process to make a design. But whenever you're asking them to make a design while learning how to do a process and they don't know how to use the process yet, it can be very challenging for the individual. Because you're asking them to learn how to do something and to utilize it as you're learning how to do it, rather than teaching you this is how to do it and now can we utilize it in a project.
I would disagree.
Yeah.
I think if you're learning software, we can go through all the clicks and bytes and explain everything, but the best way to learn the software is to dive in.
Well, I agree, but there is a difference between learning a software and directly diving into design, because you can learn a software by in certain ways when you're learning how to
I don't know
draw.
anything about software, but preface.
But I'll give you an example. If you ask a student that's never used like a 3D design software, you ask them to design in the software before they've learned how to use it,
It's wild, but it's simultaneous.
yeah.
Well, yeah, this is interesting.
Again, I don't teach it, so.
So this
but I
is
understand
a.
how it's taught.
Yeah, I've watching my son go through curriculum. He's in just finishing up his first year of architecture, and his curriculum was extremely different than curriculum that I started with, and they tied say software to various like specific mechanisms, like specific tools, like we're going to do these particular types of locks and you're going to make this project, and we're also going to learn 3D printing from that. And they broke it down in such bite-sized pieces that you learned the software, but you didn't just go everywhere. You know, you had rails on learning these tools, and then okay, we're going to learn laser cutting, and we're going to learn to use metal and acrylic. And so you're learning a couple materials. You're learning how to do laser cutting, and you're learning these some two-dimensional drafting with that. Each thing was broken down, but you were simultaneously doing a design project. But it was just how much are you embedding and how far are you going in that you could break into smaller pieces.
That would be great. I know, like, for example, whenever I was first introduced with laser cutting, it was more, we're doing a project and there needs to be laser cutting elements in there, and go figure that out now. And I don't know if that is normally conducive to, like, education.
I'm sorry, if I may, I want to maybe steer this. And so I think the bigger picture of this, and it's pretty difficult, and you and I both struggled with how to present this, right? It's a book, and you all have not had the opportunity to read it, right? But the bigger picture here with what is trying to be said is Seth has observed throughout his time as a student that there are certain groups that struggle with, and they'll struggle with similar things. Not everyone struggles with that same thing, but there will be a group that struggles with something and another group that struggles with something else, right? And he wanted to analyze what it might take in order for professors to maybe communicate in a different way, or to change the way of teaching in a certain way that might capture those groups who are struggling in different ways, right? So in what ways does architectural education see to everyone, right? All of the different learning styles. And also, I'm sorry if I'm being a little, okay. And also there's another pretty big argument that architectural education maybe shouldn't even be in a university setting, right? So these are the conversations that I think would.
See, to me, architecture, I love architecture in a university setting. I think architecture being an academic field is a great thing. My biggest belief is that I don't believe you need to go to college to be an architect. I do not believe necessarily what they teach in college prepares you to be in the field. Every school is different. I'm sure some do better, some do worse. But I do question if what the things that I have been taught are the things that need to be gatekept from a general public to become an architect.
So the purpose of this book is to open it up to everyone?
Yes.
Well, I can tell you there's a huge difference when you hire people even from different schools. And like whether they're able to engage consistently, with the process, so like the educational process and who you're doing that with is huge impact on actual performance in the field.
Like one of the biggest sections in the book, one of the most important things to me is regardless of if you need the requirement to go to college to be an architect, I think the fact that so much information is almost locked between the university that you choose to go to, whenever there's no reason that like for example, it is impossible almost to find what this school teaches online. It just doesn't really exist. It's a public university, and there's no reason why the information and curriculum needs to be not quite hidden, but not shown. It makes me think about Harvard University's coding classes, that every single one is online. Certainly you can go to Harvard and take their classes, but if you do want to code, they're all online. And a movement in the general academic space, especially in a public university, to take all of their resources and freely give it to the public, because if what they're teaching is just these resources, more people should know. Not to mention, a lot of the architectural concepts that we do teach can just be freely given. It's not like they're anything that's super crazy.
Did you spend time in the studio?
What do you mean?
I mean, did you spend time working in the studio?
Like ever?
Well, just in general, were you a person that stayed and worked in studio?
Yes.
Okay. And the dialogues that you had with other students, the dialogues that you had with descripts, like those are interactive dialogues, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, in the moment, looking at something, didn't that impact your education?
I think that's the purpose of the college. So I think what you're trying to get at is that you go to Harvard for the interaction. You want to come to USF for the interaction of the people and like-minded people studying architecture, but you still want to show all of your curriculum out there so that you can have professionals in the field not be hidden from the curriculum of USF, so we can open up that dialogue.
But those are two different things. I mean, you can put everything online, that's fine, but you're talking about education, that like somehow somebody learning to code is the same as somebody learning to do architecture.
What's the difference?
You can learn to do math online.
You can't learn architecture online?
No.
Why?
No, I absolutely
Why?
don't think, because the interaction plays differently.
You don't
So
think
I
you
come
interact
from
online with people?
I come from a jazz, started music jazz background, for instance. Think about improv. You're in the room, improv. You're feeding off of the other players. In an immediate dialogue. That's what happens when you truly shredding in an improvisational flow state. In a communal setting.
Do people not play jazz by themselves ever?
No.
Really?
No. Yeah. You can play an instrument by yourself, but you're not playing jazz by yourself.
I don't know if I agree with that. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that you can play a solo by yourself. You're playing a solo.
But that's not jazz.
I mean, you're playing an instrument. I see jazz has some other, you know, structure to it that you're improving with other people.
It has to do with spontaneity
Yeah.
and creativity in the moment.
I'm going to
Yeah.
disagree with that a little bit, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
You're-
Even
yeah.
coding, if we look at coding as a math problem or something like that, coding's more like a language, and I think the creativity, being spontaneous in the moment and finding creative solutions, just like architecture, that is not an architecture-specific thing. I think you can collaborate online, and I understand where you're coming from, where you want to have that communication, you want to build off other people. But I think just to solely exclude, we can't have a studio online that'll ruin the whole architecture process and learning to become an architect. I think we're boiling it down way
Well,
too.
are
we're
you
being hasty in general.
interacting online? I mean, you can say, like, you have people's spaces, like, we all had COVID where we worked online and we had collaboration through that, so
2
that's,
years of it.
you know, that's different, but if you're gonna say, I'm gonna throw a curriculum on and you're gonna watch videos and you're
But
gonna
it's, I don't think
dialogue.
it's saying that.
Are you saying that?
No.
Okay.
The thing that,
You're
if I
saying,
could,
you're
if I could
saying that
produce.
that we can sit around on screens and have a studio time, yeah, that's.
No, I don't
that's-
think that's what he's saying.
No, I'm saying what it takes to be an architect.
Let her-
Yeah.
Please. I think what this is suggesting is more of, this is giving, he said it's supplementary, it's not, it is this and it is only this, it's something to have alongside while you're going through this whole process that might cater to those people who don't have their problems addressed in a studio, in standard studio setting, because their process or ways of thinking might not line up with the process that is trying to be taught. And I think this being, you know, like, yes, supplementary in nature, but I think saying it's supplementary kind of takes from the weight of the things that's being suggested and talked about in this book. I think it's just important that architecture is a profession that is so focused on individuality in a setting that's so creative. I think it's really hard to say, you know, online might not work for you, but that doesn't mean you're not going to have that same general interaction you might have. It's just taken in a different form. But someone else might do better that way. Yeah, I mean, COVID was awful for many reasons, and you know, communication and collaboration physically is needed, but that doesn't mean that if it's happening at all, it's happening in the best way it can be for everyone. And as a student myself, it was kind of loosely brought up earlier, but someone said, I don't remember who, ideally, professors should be taking note of, I see how this student's working and what they kind of want to do. They might not know what they're trying to do, but I might help them go in that direction they're already trying to go and help them see it themselves. But it's hard given the time frame. Semesters are so fast that it's hard to really learn everyone and see what they're all trying to do, and it kind of ends up being kind of like the whole coding thing that was going on, being thrown into something and say learn the process as well as still moving towards the end product works for certain things, but not when it's so layered, when it's so dependent on the person and what they bring to the overall table. You know, it's different learning, okay, if I want to do this, I click these buttons. That's kind of clear cut, and it might be easier if the activity that's being, you know, done is of that nature. But architecture is different. It's a lot more intuitive. It's a lot more dependent on the individual and, for lack of better terms, their style or way of thinking and process. And trying to put that in the same like framework and structure as something so clear-cut, I think is a large part of the problem, because then those groups of people are left out. And they need some guidance and structure for themselves.
I want to touch on that. I cheated. I've already read the book, so
I'm sorry, can
sorry
I just
about that.
have,
Yeah.
pause you for just a moment? I know. Go ahead.
I think you raise interesting questions. And the question is, what are you learning in academia versus what you need to be an architect? And it's an interesting challenge every school's having at the moment, because the licensure for architecture is pushing heavily in, the profession's pushing heavily in, and essentially architecture, if you look at the trajectory of the evolution of the education, is essentially becoming more and more directed by skills-based NAP requirements, and that's what technically the program has to meet. Highly problematic, in my opinion. I think you're repeating a lot of the problems we have in your book and in your proposal. I'll come from a completely different perspective. I believe complexity is the essence of what we teach, and what you've done, and you've built it up in the sequence of set of skills that you layer on. You first learn this, you first learn that, you first learn, and I think that's highly problematic as a methodology. I think as a way we must immerse you from day one in the most complex situations you'll find yourself, that you will have to work out a spatial understanding and knowledge base in the way you work. Link that to the idea of multiple intelligence educational theory, and you'll be able to, when you run your studios, etc., if this person's strength in model making, spatial, this person in this form. In other words, how we learn is not a topic of conversation typically in architectural education. And I think the multiple intelligence methodology has enormous opportunity, because we all learn differently. And even like in studios that I run, the product and how you work, I don't mind how you work. If you've got this strength, and maybe you're going to write me a whole thesis in it, it's all fine. In other words, we have to have that flexibility, but we have to put you in complexity. This notion that you've got that we can be simplistic and additive, it comes from the Bauhaus, it's as boring as thing, and it's really problematic because you have to learn this one, then this one, and it all becomes additive, and finally we get you to the thesis. As opposed to a panarchical view of the world in which you spiral and you learn and you set loops, but your curriculum doesn't have a loop in it, it's additive. And in other words, why don't you loop from day one, everything? And what you do by that is that you become more sophisticated and more knowledgeable in a methodology that you're creating for yourself through the idea of multiple intelligence. In fact, to begin to emerge and be able to take on the complexities of it, but be able to do it in not the mathematical language, not in the skill set. I mean, I've been around long enough to know how many computer programs do you have to learn over a career. It's ridiculous, right? But what you have to learn is how that translates into form and those relationships back into the complexity of the world, from human significance to the economic system. So living in a state of fractured complexity, I believe, is very essential. The typical architecture program eliminates complexity from your debate, right? We're going to do a room today, right? And we're going to look at it in light, and we're going to do it in form. And that's the sort of the Bauhaus methodology. And it's, for me, completely irrelevant today. So I think there's actually a lot of things out there, if you look through the educational philosophies that are coming out, that could be really impactful. But the dilemma for the school is we have this tick list that we have to meet every number of years to say we're educating you as an architect. If we could separate that, which historically was, because you could become an architect never going to university, right? No problem. That was a trajectory. Now we've integrated it to, maybe you have to separate it out. So it becomes really very interesting if you move around all the architectural schools of what they're defining, they're trying to teach you. Yeah, there's this heavy lid of NACOB on it, but there's also this other question of what we try to teach, and that's the amazing difference between the schools.
See, that's one thing that fascinates me, is It is because it is a requirement to go to school to be an architect in every single state but 11, and those 11 states have requirements that, for example, in like Hawaii, you have to be you have to intern for about 11 years. So it's either you can go to school or But
Apprenticeship, yeah.
when I imagine
This is a standard model throughout the world.
when I imagine the necessity of having to go to school to become an architect and the requirements that like NCARB creates that say that you must teach these things, I think that starts to take away from individual schools of the way that they want to teach.
But it doesn't take away from architecture education. So you're conflating the potential of architecture education to schools. Don't, right? In the world today, there are multiple paths to building and doing different types of buildings, right? However you want to categorize it. Academia is one of them, right? Apprenticeship's another one. In many countries around the world, you can go out and design your own home and build it. You don't even have to have anything, right?
So then what makes an architect different?
This becomes a really interesting question. What would be the reasoning to go to university to become an architect? I think is a refinement of your question.
Well, right now the reasoning is because you have to become one.
But you don't.
You do. In Florida, you have to have a.
In Florida, that's fine.
Well, that's where I live.
Right.
That's
But
what
you could
most
choose another
other states are like.
Well, you don't have to be an architect.
Would it?
I mean, you could be a great draftsman.
But you can't.
Yep.
Yeah, because you're not an architect.
Well, okay. So one of the things.
Because like the creativity is this is kind of getting into the question of like building versus architecture. Like you could do like a building, and draft a building. If you don't want the title of architect, you can be in the profession and be part of that. But to be an architect and you're exposed to the creativity of that.
Do you think you need to go to school to be exposed to the creativity of that?
Yes.
Why?
Yes. Is it possible for somebody to be creative outside of a university?
Everybody is.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Everybody has creative outlets and can learn to create. But I wouldn't discount the university setting and the methodology to be exposed to these things.
I don't think I discount the university setting. If there wasn't a requirement to university setting, people would still go to university. But universities would have to be good enough to make you want to go to learn something. But because it's a requirement, it kind of removes that.
It's a requirement to have the title architect. That's different to saying, if you want to build and you want to design,
That's
design.
what
No
I'm
problem.
saying.
I agree
Okay,
wholeheartedly.
but I
why
think you're
can't you
pushing-
call yourself an architect without going to
Because
school?
that's a license thing.
So what does it take to get your license? What are you trying to prove? Why do you need a license? For health, safety, and welfare, make sure the building does not fall. The stance of an architect is to make sure the building is safe to be in.
Correct.
So what is being taught in architecture school?
And that's what the dilemma of the registration authority, that's what they're coming down hard onto the architect. But if we just can separate the fact that you can design and build and be as creative as you want, no problem. If you want to sign a drawing to say that this building meets these standards, there's a requirement to do. We can debate whether that's best to achieve that requirement in academia or through a different
Well,
form.
like when I go to my doctor,
Mhm.
I'd like to know that they went to medical school,
Mhm.
so they can call themselves a doctor. And I'm not being facetious, I mean.
No, I understand.
one
You
to
need
one.
some force
And-
some authoritative force that's going to put their name on the fact
Do you
to
take a test to be a
verify.
doctor?
Yes.
Do you take a test to be an architect?
Yes.
Why is the school the thing that stops you before taking the test? If the test is what proves that you can put up a building, if the test is what proves that the building is safe, what does the school
test
do?
proves that you have studied and that you know enough about putting together a building and health and safety and history and theory and mechanical systems and structural systems. It's just a test.
Mhm.
It's a completely passable test. I mean, it's kind
It's
of.
a two-step process.
Yeah.
Like the university has always been coupled with the internship.
With profession.
You know, so the profession, you know, like in my firm, we take the internship seriously. You know, where
We do.
you know, it's everything you need to know about this. You know, we very, you know,
Do you think
taking
architects
people on the
could
job
not
sites.
have interns that just start as interns and continue through interns?
You know, proof is in outcomes, and I will say, like, yeah, I've seen people different starting points and, you know, how they perform in the profession, and it makes a huge difference. You know, we've had people that have been just a pure apprenticeship, right? We've had, you know, people that have gone to
Do you mean like a
different
drafting degree or something?
Correct, correct. And go that route, and technically very proficient, and it never connects. You know, to the design side never catches up. You know,
You don't
so
think they could go, so you think they need to go to school to get that?
they,
Or do you think that person, if they went to school, could never have done it?
yeah, I mean, you can already just like on the analysis of everybody that's gone through. You know, if somebody went from that starting point, I've never seen somebody, you know, make the leap. Now, is there the anomaly that, you know, makes the leap? Sure, I'm sure there's many examples of that, but yeah, even the different levels, you know, different qualities of architectural education, we've seen vast performance difference in the profession. So I don't think you can discount the
Yeah,
outcomes.
I agree. If you go through 6 years of any kind of training, you will be better than if you did not go through any kind of training.
I'm also gonna say, you said you're seeing differences out of different schools.
Yes.
Isn't that the problem you're trying to address?
That
By
one of
making
them
it
is.
more public? Like, wouldn't that
It's like more,
resolve
it's
your
like more
problem with that?
standardized testing.
I don't think it should be more
Yeah.
standardized.
The great thing about schools is that they have internal cultures that have developed over decades in many cases. They have place-based sensibilities. I would think to learn about architecture in Florida is quite different than New Hampshire because of the sense of place and way communities are built, and the simple landscape itself. You know, very different issues from place to place in the US. I think there's 2 or 3 of the schools in Florida that have an interconnectivity and a history that's rather interesting and beautiful. You know, I've led 2 full accreditations. I've contributed a great deal to another 3 or 4. And it's interesting how the accreditation process has changed over the years. And currently, it's near ridiculous. Like, I wrote a big chunk of our report
Yeah, I've read them.
for the accreditation that's coming up here, you know, a few months. And it's an assessment of how you assess yourself, which I find bizarre. I mean, I think it couldn't have been written by architects. And I was at the annual administrators conference a few years ago when this was unveiled, as was the business of going online completely with multiple curricula around the country, by the way. And I was just shocked by how bad it was. And then I finally got the report. I mean, I got the guidelines. I started to look at them. And you know, you have to bend your curriculum to be able to assess yourself the way that they want you to assess yourself. But it's kind of, to me, it was just like the exact opposite of how you should. It had nothing to do with the quality of design. It had to do with how you assess your design. And anyone who's been teaching for a while, like I can get a group of faculty from different universities and put up a bunch of projects, and they'll gravitate towards certain qualities of each of these projects because they're professionals, they have a good eye, they can read things very well, and there's a kind of almost unspoken discourse that takes place.
Could it be
like I go to other schools and I do crits for thesis or whatever, and it's so easy to do. And it's not like I'm this guy from Florida that thinks differently about architecture. And I often critted with a person from Canada a few times. We don't know one another, we have nothing in common, but we have this robust conversation because we both kind of can identify architecture and quality like very quickly.
I think one of the reasons probably they're pushing for the way that you assess it is because those unknown qualities are some of the hardest things to teach people of how to, like, how to see architecture. And so whenever they're looking for,
Some people can't see architecture.
I think
Some
that
people
probably,
can't see space.
Probably.
I mean, for me, architecture is space.
Mm.
That's just, you know, I don't expect anyone to agree with that, but for me, it's space, and space is shaped in so many different ways, outside, inside. We have a very similar education. We have a very similar education. And I think that, you know, like I think you hire from 2 universities, probably, primarily, I'm guessing.
Actually, much wider now.
Which, well, that's because, is that because you don't have enough people coming from other universities? You get more applicants coming to Florida.
Yeah, I mean, quite honestly, there's universities that we've seen the caliber of students go down, and there's universities that, you know.
Well, universities are cyclical things.
Yeah, so we've definitely widened, but, you know, we can go, I mean, there's certain universities that, like, they would have to really blow us away. You know, so I can tell you I can almost tell you exactly where that student went just by looking at a few pages of their portfolio.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, like right now, you have quite a few students from this institution, and I know their history, I know who they are, and I'm very pleased because you're a really good office. I mean, you know, I'm pleased that they landed in an office I really trust and respect. You sound terribly cynical about your education.
I probably am.
You
That's
see,
probably a
I
fair
think,
point.
I don't know who you had as critics. I don't think you're ever, well, I didn't teach studios really regularly until recently. I have so many things to say to you, and we're running out of time, but I think that, like, to run a studio is a very strategic thing, right? And to run a first-year studio, a third-year studio, a 6th-year studio, or 5th-year studio is completely different in terms of skill sets you've had that the students come to you with, in terms of intellectually where they are, in terms of intellectually what they want and need. And I don't mean need like per NAEB, I mean just need as emerging designers. And I think teaching first year is repetitive and a bit more dictatorial, because they have to learn a skill set to progress. And then teaching a higher level studio, you have to give them a lot of rope. Like if you were to go in my studio now and see the diversity of projects, you might be shocked. I mean, it's not me making those decisions, it's them. And I'm kind of the consultant. And this is probably the next to last studio for quite a few of them. And I think depending on where you teach, you take a slightly different role in terms of strategically how you're setting up the problem. And writing the problem is half the success of the studio. You have to write an interesting problem, I think. For me, this has been true.
No, I agree.
And how much do you change along the way? How much does your curriculum change within a semester sometimes if you're getting certain feedback
Ideally
or not getting
by
something?
student.
Well, it's interesting. In the lower studios, you can see no one got it. And so this is what's good about teaching. You have to think of an exercise to do in class in about 5 minutes, send everyone else out to make a model or do a drawing, come back, get more feedback to put everyone back on track. It's really hard work. Like we have a lot of young people teaching in lower studios, and they have to be on their toes all the time.
That's not formulaic.
It's anything but. Where you're trying to go to a certain place, and most of the studios are trying to go to a certain place because you want a body of students with a certain foundation, and then they can start shooting off in different places. Now, I've seen exercises from other schools, and it's clearly, as my father would say, excuse this, but it was like every man for himself and Paddy for Ireland, and my dad's Scottish, so he can say that. And the students are shooting off in every different direction in first year. And for me, that would be a difficult place to teach, because Lord knows what you're going to get in third year. So, I mean, and this is just my experience, the way I teach. My undergraduate education was completely different from my graduate education. I mean, completely different. I would be a very different person if I studied mathematics and then went to my graduate school, as many did. You know, I went to school with a lot of philosophy majors and English majors and whatnot. And the people that had some background in architecture, even if it was kind of architecture light, liberal arts, say an architecture within more of a liberal arts education for 4 years, moved much faster than people who were walking in the door and hadn't drawn a line.
Mm.
It was hard for those kids.
So it's interesting, just to contrast, my education had a different model. We would actually come into the studio and we'd all sit around a circle, share where we were, and we would collectively, with the instructor, work out what project we're going to do.
Mhm.
The space that was very deliberative, cooperative discussion, and there would be a sense of agreement. We'd work out the schedule, we'd work out how things worked. There wasn't a predetermined place you would get to. And then some of the challenge of the instructor would be I'd be coming in at a different position with different techniques and skill sets than others. And this would all be responded to in a very open and transformation basis, right? So it was a very different model of how we interacted in the classroom and how we mutually got to a certain place. I will tell you, by a year out of school, whoever came from any other direction, providing you as an individual continue to learn and be dedicated to your craft, you'll end up in the same position. That's my sort of reflection on the history of this. So,
No, go. It's good. I was
How do you
just gonna say,
stay
we have,
dedicated to your craft? How do you stay dedicated to your craft, and what does that mean?
I think that is actually, I know you're reflecting back. The one thing I think you should do is say, you should be reflective as what it will mean for you to move forward post this, right? And don't sit looking back over your shoulder. How do you take this? Because I think that we as architects, this has to, at school or through our education, we have to find a means by which we individually will continue the study of architecture through both practice, but also what we read, what we study, the places we go to, how we draw. So our method of understanding the world and progressing our craft is essentially what needs to be taken away. Quite frankly, the thesis is a moment, but it's the craft and your way of thinking and the way you approach the world that is the most important thing for you. Because we can look around the world, and in truth, we can probably tell 90% of the architects when they graduated and from what school they graduated, because they haven't progressed one iota after school. They're still doing the same sort of thing that they did at graduation. And that is really damaging to the world and to us as individuals, in my opinion. So I think that what you really should be doing is saying, so what does this mean for me? What is my personal way of learning and continuing? Because it's a craft. And you are a very different person 30 years later designing a building, right? If you just look at someone like Mises' evolution, right? Or whatever architect you want to look at, it becomes really interesting. So I know you're sort of looking back and you're trying to reform this. I would urge you, put this aside and say, so what are the things that are orchestrating for me to go forward? How am I going to learn? Not how am I going to become an architect. I'm going to learn this craft of space making, the spatiality of it, and how that relates to being human. That's where you need to go.
I think that's the most important thing that I have gotten from this project is understanding through myself what it takes for me to learn. And like, I think one of the first sections that I wrote about is just saying throughout architecture, the biggest thing you can impart on a student is teaching them how to learn architecture. Because once you get out of it, you should never stop learning. That's the goal.
Everyone talks about an undergraduate degree as a time when you're learning how to learn. And then you go to graduate school with a skill set that allows you to learn with great focus and intensity. And I think there's a little bit of truth to that. Although high school seems to be the new undergrad college now. In high school, you always have to learn how to learn.
We are running out of time,
Yeah,
so
I think,
any closing remarks?
I do want to say, I think the point both you and you both have been making are a lot more closely tied together than it might feel at first. Because I absolutely, like, from a student's perspective, what you said how you said yours was set up, just the curriculum in general, or how a studio is approached, sounds amazing. Like, that collaboration, I think, is something you also were valuing and talking about how necessary it is. I don't think it's only between the professor and one singular student. I think if it were in a setting, if the setting were designed in such a way that the whole studio is involved and there is the interaction, you're not just learning from the professor, you're not just learning from, you know, books and sources, it's
No.
from other people, and you have to take that in. And I think that the reason you learn is because of individuality. The reason there's anything to learn from other people is because other people think differently, might have different values, and you say, okay, I realize that's actually important. I might not have initially, but now I do. It's that, but that also requires everyone speaking and seeing where there are disconnects, seeing where there are problems, misunderstandings, or the opposite, where there are connections that everyone might have in common or something. But it takes having an understanding of everyone being different and knowing how to have a process that both appreciates, reflects, and guides every single one of those. And I think collaborative settings are very good because those problems are very evident. If everyone's talking, you're going to notice the disconnects or where things aren't lining up. And I think that's a big thing of what he was addressing. Again, I know there, you know, we haven't all read the book fully, but I've read a decent bit of it, and a big thing that's mentioned and focused is how that is, I don't want to say lacking, that's just cold cut, it is lacking in that department, but it could seriously benefit if there were a lot more of that type of discourse, that type of interaction.
But let me just add one comment and get to the next jury. But I could see this reflection as a personal methodology for how you engage with an education, on how that education, however that education is disseminated, on how you digest, how you assimilate and feed information from your personal perspective, and not place that on a curriculum basis. Perspective is a funny thing that when you go back, I don't know how many times I've gone back and thought about a particular studio project, and like years later, oh, that's what they were teaching. But you have to put yourself, apply this to your internal methodology for how you digest that and how you are more open to how that is being given versus curriculum. But so thank you.
Thanks, Ed.
No, I was just going to say, just never forget, creativity is collaborative. So as much as you do it, your challenge is to become collaborative in order to be creative.
I agree. Thank you.
We got some good conversation. We forgot to